The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle as Prince George walked quietly beside his protection officer. At 12 years old, he had grown accustomed to the formal routines that governed royal life, but today felt different somehow. The usual buzz of activity seemed muted, and even the birds appeared to sing more softly than usual. George had always been observant, a trait that both pleased and occasionally worried his parents. While other children his age might race through their daily activities without much thought, George had developed an almost uncanny ability to notice the subtle details that others missed. Perhaps it came from years of being watched himself, or maybe it was simply his nature, but he could read people's expressions, catch whispered conversations, and sense when something was amiss. Today, that familiar feeling of unease settled in his stomach as they made their way toward the main entrance where the changing of the guard would soon take place. It was one of his favorite ceremonies to observe, not because of the pageantry that tourists came to see, but because he had come to know many of the guards personally. They were more than just the stoic figures in red uniforms and tall black hats that the public admired. They were real people with families, hopes, and struggles. Thomas Mitchell had been one of the Queen's Guard for nearly 8 years. At 32, he carried himself with the dignity and precision that his position demanded, but George had noticed something troubling about Thomas lately. The man's usual confident posture seemed slightly deflated, and there was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. George had first met Thomas 3 years ago during a private family event, and since then, they had exchanged brief but meaningful conversations whenever their paths crossed. Thomas came from a working-class family in Manchester. His father had been a factory worker, and his mother cleaned offices in the evenings to help make ends meet. For Thomas, joining the military and eventually becoming one of the Queen's Guard represented not just a career, but a chance to lift his family out of their financial struggles. He sent money home regularly and took immense pride in wearing the uniform that represented centuries of British tradition and honor. But lately, that pride had been slowly eroding under the weight of cruel words and deliberate humiliation. It had started small, with snide comments about his accent during informal gatherings. Some of his colleagues, particularly those from more privileged backgrounds, seemed to take pleasure in pointing out his grammatical mistakes or mocking the way he pronounced certain words. They would laugh at his stories about growing up in a council flat, treating his background as entertainment rather than respecting the journey that had brought him to his current position. As George approached the area where the guards were preparing for the ceremony, he could hear voices coming from behind one of the stone pillars. Something in the tone made him pause, gesturing for his protection officer to wait a moment. The man nodded, understanding that the young prince sometimes needed a few minutes to observe and process what was happening around him. "Look at Mitchell trying to polish his boots properly," came a voice dripping with disdain. "Bet he learned that technique in some Manchester back alley." George felt his chest tighten as he recognized the voice of James Worthington, a guard who came from a family with old money and older prejudices. Worthington had attended expensive private schools and seemed to believe that his birth circumstances made him inherently superior to others. "Maybe we should teach him the proper way to hold his rifle," added another voice, this one belonging to Christopher Blackwood. "Can't have the tourists seeing sloppy form from someone who probably learned military discipline from street fighting." George moved closer, staying hidden behind the pillar but positioning himself where he could see what was happening. Thomas stood rigidly at attention, his face a mask of professional composure, but George could see the slight tremor in his hands and the way his jaw was clenched tight. The young prince had seen that expression before. It was the look of someone trying desperately to maintain their dignity while being systematically torn down. "Tell us, Mitchell," Worthington continued, his voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that comes from years of unchecked privilege. "How exactly does one go from scrubbing toilets to standing guard for royalty? Did you lie on your application about your qualifications?" Thomas's voice, when he finally spoke, was steady but strained. "I earned my position through service and dedication, sir." The formal "sir" seemed to amuse Worthington even more. "Oh, how refreshing. The working-class boy knows his place after all. But tell me, do you really think you belong here, among people who understand true service and sacrifice?" George felt anger building in his chest, but he forced himself to remain still and continue observing. He needed to understand the full scope of what was happening before he acted. This wasn't the first time he had witnessed bullying, but seeing it directed at someone he respected, and cared about made it feel personal in a way that surprised him. "I think," Thomas said carefully, "that service is measured by actions, not by the circumstances of one's birth." Blackwood laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the stone walls. "How noble, how very working-class noble. But you see, Mitchell, some of us were raised understanding what true service means. We were taught from birth about duty and honor. We didn't have to scrape and claw our way here from the gutter." "My family taught me about duty and honor too," Thomas replied, his voice still controlled, but with an edge that suggested his patience was wearing thin. "They taught me that a man's worth comes from his character and his willingness to work hard for what he believes in." Worthington stepped closer to Thomas, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that George had to strain to hear. "Your family taught you survival, Mitchell. There's a difference. Survival makes people desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. We wouldn't want you to make any mistakes while representing the crown, would we?" The implied threat was clear, and George saw Thomas's composure finally begin to crack slightly. The man's hands, which had been steady throughout the verbal assault, now trembled noticeably. George realized that this wasn't just casual bullying. It was a calculated campaign designed to break Thomas down and possibly force him out of his position. "Perhaps," Blackwood added with mock sympathy, "it would be better for everyone if you considered a transfer, somewhere more suited to your background. I hear they need security guards at shopping centers, much more appropriate for someone of your breeding." George had heard enough. The anger that had been building inside him was now a white-hot flame, but he forced himself to think strategically. Simply confronting the bullies directly might provide temporary satisfaction, but it wouldn't address the underlying problem. Thomas needed protection, and he needed it in a way that would prevent future incidents while preserving his dignity. The young prince stepped back from his hiding place and gestured to his protection officer. "I need to speak with my father immediately," he said quietly. "It's urgent." As they walked away from the scene, George's mind was already working on a plan. He had been raised to understand that privilege came with responsibility, and that his position gave him both the power and the obligation to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Thomas Mitchell represented everything that George had been taught to value: dedication, hard work, genuine service, and quiet dignity in the face of adversity. But more than that, Thomas represented something that George was just beginning to understand about the world beyond the palace walls. There were people who judged others based on their accents, their backgrounds, and their family histories rather than their character and abilities. There were people who used their own advantages to tear down others rather than lift them up. George had been born into unimaginable privilege, but he was beginning to understand that this privilege was meaningless unless he used it to make the world more fair and just. Today, he had witnessed an injustice, and tomorrow he would begin the process of setting it right. As he walked through the corridors toward his father's office, George thought about the conversations he would need to have and the careful steps he would need to take. He couldn't simply order the bullying to stop. That would only drive it underground and possibly make things worse for Thomas. Instead, he needed to create a situation where Thomas's value would be recognized and where the bullies would be forced to confront their own behavior. The protection officer noticed the determination in the young prince's stride and the set of his jaw. He had seen that expression before, usually when George was working on a particularly challenging problem or when he was deeply committed to achieving a specific goal. It was the look of someone who had inherited not just a title, but a genuine sense of responsibility and justice. George's mind was already several steps ahead, considering all the angles and potential consequences of his intervention. He knew that his actions over the next few days would have far-reaching effects, not just for Thomas, but for everyone who worked within the castle walls. He was about to learn a valuable lesson about the weight of leadership and the responsibility that came with having the power to change lives. The corridor seemed longer than usual as George made his way toward what he knew would be a conversation that would test his ability to articulate his concerns and his growing understanding of fairness and justice. He was no longer just a 12-year-old boy observing the world around him. He was becoming someone who was ready to act on his observations and take responsibility for making things better. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, but for George, the day was just beginning. He had witnessed something that challenged his understanding of how people should treat each other, and he was determined to do something about it. The question was no longer whether he should act, but how he could act most effectively. Thomas Mitchell continued his duties, unaware that his quiet dignity in the face of cruelty had touched the heart of someone with the power to change his circumstances. The ceremony would go on as scheduled, the tourists would take their photos, and the ancient traditions would be maintained. But beneath the surface, change was already in motion, set in action by a young prince who had learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with swords or proclamations, but with careful planning, moral courage, and an unwavering commitment to doing what is right. The heavy oak door of Prince William's private study closed behind George with a soft thud that seemed to echo the weight of the conversation he was about to have. His father looked up from a stack of official documents, immediately noting the serious expression on his son's face. Over the years, William had learned to read George's moods and expressions, and what he saw now was not the typical concern of a 12-year-old, but something deeper and more troubling. "What's on your mind, George?" William asked, setting down his pen and giving his son his full attention. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows cast a warm glow across the room, but the atmosphere felt heavy with the weight of unspoken concerns. George had rehearsed this conversation during his walk to his father's office, but now that the moment had arrived, he found himself struggling to find the right words. How do you explain the complexities of workplace bullying to someone who has never experienced it firsthand? How do you convey the subtle cruelties that happen in the shadows of ceremony and tradition? "Father," George began, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil, "I witnessed something today that I believe requires attention. It involves Thomas Mitchell, one of the Queen's Guard." William's expression grew more serious. Any issue involving the royal protection detail was taken with utmost gravity, not just for security reasons, but because these men and women were trusted with the safety and well-being of the royal family. "Tell me what happened," William said, leaning forward slightly to indicate he was giving George his complete focus. George took a deep breath and began to recount what he had witnessed behind the stone pillar. He was careful to repeat the conversations as accurately as possible, noting not just the words that were spoken, but the tone, the body language, and the clear power dynamics at play. As he spoke, he watched his father's expression grow increasingly troubled. William had served in the military himself and understood the importance of unit cohesion and mutual respect among those who served together. What George was describing went against everything he believed about honor, service, and the treatment of fellow servicemen. "How long do you think this has been going on?" William asked when George finished his account. "I'm not certain," George replied thoughtfully, "but I've noticed changes in Thomas's demeanor over the past several months. He seems less confident than he used to be, and there's a sadness in his eyes that wasn't there before." William was struck by his son's perceptiveness. At 12 years old, George was already demonstrating an ability to read people and situations that would serve him well in his future role. But more importantly, he was showing genuine concern for the welfare of others. "What do you think we should do?" William asked, curious to hear his son's perspective before offering his own thoughts. George had been anticipating this question and had given it considerable thought. "I believe we need to address this in a way that protects Thomas while also ensuring that this behavior doesn't continue. But I don't think a direct confrontation would be the most effective approach." "Why not?" William inquired, impressed by the careful consideration his son was already giving to the complexities of the situation. "Because if we simply order them to stop, they might become more subtle in their harassment, making it harder to detect and potentially more damaging to Thomas. Also, it might make Thomas feel like he can't handle his own problems, which could further undermine his confidence." William nodded approvingly. George's analysis showed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and group dynamics that was remarkable for his age. "What alternative approach do you suggest?" William asked. George's eyes brightened slightly as he outlined the plan he had been developing. "I think we should create opportunities for Thomas to demonstrate his expertise and value in front of others. If we can arrange situations where his knowledge, skills, and character become apparent to everyone, including Worthington and Blackwood, it becomes much harder for them to maintain their dismissive attitude." "That's an interesting approach," William said, genuinely impressed. "Do you have specific ideas about how we might accomplish this?" George nodded enthusiastically. "Thomas has extensive knowledge about military history and protocol. I've heard him explain various aspects of royal ceremony and tradition to newer guards, and his understanding is remarkable. What if we arranged for him to provide historical briefings to visiting dignitaries or foreign military officers? It would showcase his expertise while serving a legitimate purpose. William considered this suggestion carefully. It was creative, practical, and would indeed provide Thomas with opportunities to shine while serving real institutional needs. Additionally, George continued, I've noticed that Thomas has a natural ability to mentor younger guards. He's patient, thorough, and genuinely cares about helping others succeed. Perhaps we could formalize this role, making him responsible for training new recruits or leading professional development sessions. You've given this considerable thought, William observed with evident pride in his son's analytical abilities and compassionate nature. There's something else, George said, his voice becoming more serious. I think we need to address the underlying culture that allows this kind of behavior to flourish. It's not enough to elevate Thomas. We need to make it clear that treating colleagues with disrespect is unacceptable, regardless of their background or circumstances. William was struck by the maturity of his son's observation. George had identified not just the immediate problem, but the systemic issues that created and sustained it. How do you suggest we accomplish that? William asked. I think we need to have conversations with the leadership of the Guard about creating clear expectations for how personnel treat each other. We could also institute regular team-building activities that help people get to know each other as individuals rather than just as representatives of their backgrounds. As they talked, William realized that his son was not just reporting a problem, but proposing a comprehensive solution that addressed both the immediate situation and the broader cultural issues that had allowed it to develop. George's approach showed wisdom beyond his years and a genuine understanding of leadership principles. There's one more thing, George added quietly. I'd like to get to know Thomas better as a person. I think if others see that he has our respect and friendship, it will be harder for them to treat him poorly. William smiled at this. His son was learning that leadership was not just about giving orders or making proclamations, but about building relationships and demonstrating values through personal actions. That's a wonderful idea, George. How do you envision developing this relationship? I was thinking we could invite him to share some of his knowledge about military history with me during my studies. I'm genuinely interested in learning more about the traditions and ceremonies that are part of our heritage, and he seems to have extensive knowledge in these areas. Over the next hour, father and son continued to refine their plan. They discussed the timing of various initiatives, the people who would need to be involved, and the potential challenges they might face. William was continually impressed by George's thoughtfulness and his genuine concern for Thomas's well-being. As their conversation drew to a close, William felt a sense of pride in his son that went beyond typical parental satisfaction. George was demonstrating the kind of moral courage and leadership instincts that would serve him well in his future role. But more importantly, he was showing genuine compassion for someone who was being treated unfairly. I'm proud of you, George, William said as they prepared to put their plan into action. Not just for noticing what was happening to Thomas, but for thinking so carefully about how to address it effectively. George felt a warmth in his chest at his father's approval, but he also felt the weight of responsibility that came with having the power to influence other people's lives. He was beginning to understand that privilege was not just about what you could have, but about what you could do for others. Later that afternoon, William made several phone calls to set their plan in motion. He spoke with the captain of the guard about creating new opportunities for personnel development and mentorship. He contacted the protocol office about arranging for historical briefings to be provided to visiting officials. He also scheduled a meeting with senior leadership to discuss expectations for professional behavior and respect among all personnel. Meanwhile, George spent time in the castle library, researching military history and royal ceremonies so that he could have informed conversations with Thomas about these topics. He wanted their interactions to be genuine and beneficial for both of them, not just a charitable gesture from a privileged young man. As the day ended, George reflected on the events that had led to this moment. This morning, he had been a 12-year-old boy going about his daily routine. Tonight, he was someone who had taken responsibility for addressing an injustice and protecting someone who couldn't protect himself. He thought about Thomas, who was probably at home with his family, unaware that changes were being set in motion that would significantly improve his working conditions and career prospects. George wondered what it would be like to face the kind of daily harassment that Thomas had been enduring, and he felt renewed determination to ensure that such treatment would not continue. The young prince also thought about Worthington and Blackwood and the attitudes that had led them to treat a fellow serviceman so cruelly. He hoped that the changes they were implementing would help these men recognize the value of treating all their colleagues with respect, regardless of their backgrounds. As George prepared for bed that night, he felt a sense of satisfaction that came not from personal achievement, but from knowing that he had used his position and influence to make someone else's life better. He was learning that true leadership was not about commanding others, but about creating conditions where everyone could succeed and be treated with dignity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight, George fell asleep knowing that he had taken his first real step toward becoming the kind of leader he wanted to be. Someone who used his privilege to lift others up rather than to maintain his own position at their expense. The following morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem sharper and more vivid. Thomas Mitchell went through his usual pre-duty routine, carefully checking his uniform and mentally preparing for another day of maintaining the composure that his position demanded. He had no way of knowing that this day would mark the beginning of a transformation that would change not only his own circumstances, but also his understanding of what it meant to be truly seen and valued. Captain Robert Harrison, a man whose military bearing and fair leadership had earned him respect throughout the Guard, called Thomas into his office just before the morning briefing. Thomas felt the familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach, wondering if Worthington and Blackwood had somehow managed to file a complaint against him or create some other form of trouble. "Mitchell," Captain Harrison said, his tone professional but warmer than Thomas had expected, "I have an assignment for you that I think you'll find interesting." Thomas straightened his posture and waited for the details, his mind racing through possibilities of what this assignment might entail. "We've been asked to provide historical briefings to visiting dignitaries about royal ceremonies and military traditions. Given your extensive knowledge in these areas, I'd like you to take the lead on developing and delivering these presentations." Thomas felt a moment of disbelief, followed by a surge of excitement that he tried to keep from showing too obviously on his face. This was exactly the kind of opportunity he had hoped for when he first joined the Guard, a chance to use his knowledge and passion for history in service of his duties. "I would be honored, sir," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. "Excellent," Captain Harrison continued. "Your first presentation will be next week for a delegation of French military officers. I'll also want you to begin working with some of our newer recruits, sharing your expertise about protocol and tradition as part of their training program." As Thomas left the captain's office, he felt lighter than he had in months. For the first time in weeks, he was being recognized for his strengths rather than being diminished because of his background. He didn't know what had prompted this sudden shift in his responsibilities, but he was determined to excel in these new roles. Meanwhile, George was putting another part of their plan into action. He approached his tutor, Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, with a request that would seem perfectly natural coming from a curious 12-year-old prince interested in his heritage. "Mrs. Pemberton," George said during their morning history lesson, "I've been thinking that I'd like to learn more about the military traditions and ceremonies that are part of our royal heritage. Would it be possible to arrange for someone with expertise in this area to provide some additional instruction?" Mrs. Pemberton, a scholarly woman in her 60s who had been teaching royal children for over 2 decades, was delighted by George's initiative. "That's an excellent idea, Your Highness. Did you have someone particular in mind?" "Actually," George said, as if the thought had just occurred to him, "I've heard that Thomas Mitchell, one of the Queen's Guard, has remarkable knowledge about these subjects. Perhaps he could provide some supplementary lessons about the historical significance of various ceremonies and protocols." Mrs. Pemberton nodded approvingly. "I'll make inquiries about arranging such sessions. It would indeed be valuable for you to learn about these traditions from someone who participates in them daily." Within days, the arrangements were made. Thomas would meet with George twice weekly to discuss military history, royal ceremonies, and the evolution of various protocols over the centuries. For Thomas, these sessions represented an incredible honor and an opportunity to share his passion with someone who genuinely appreciated learning about these subjects. Their first meeting took place in the castle's library, surrounded by centuries of royal history documented in leather-bound volumes. George had prepared thoughtful questions, and Thomas had brought materials he had collected over years of study and service. "Your Highness," Thomas began, his initial nervousness giving way to enthusiasm as they delved into the subject matter. "The changing of the guard ceremony that tourists see today is actually the culmination of traditions that date back over 350 years. George listened intently as Thomas explained the evolution of various protocols, the symbolism embedded in different aspects of the ceremony, and the personal stories of guards who had served with distinction throughout history. What impressed George most was not just Thomas's knowledge, but his genuine love for the traditions he was helping to maintain. "Tell me about the training required to become one of the Queen's Guard," George asked, genuinely curious about the path Thomas had taken to reach his current position. Thomas's face lit up as he described the rigorous physical and mental preparation required for the role. He spoke about learning to stand perfectly still for hours, mastering complex drill movements, and studying the detailed protocols that governed every aspect of their duties. "The most challenging part," Thomas admitted, "wasn't the physical training, though that was certainly demanding. It was learning to embody the dignity and tradition that the uniform represents, regardless of what's happening around you." George thought about the harassment he had witnessed and wondered how Thomas managed to maintain his composure under such circumstances. "That must require tremendous inner strength," he observed. "It does," Thomas agreed, not realizing how closely his words resonated with George's recent observations. "But serving in this capacity is about something larger than yourself. When you put on this uniform, you're representing centuries of service and sacrifice. That responsibility helps you find strength you didn't know you had." As their sessions continued over the following weeks, George found himself genuinely enjoying their conversations and learning a great deal about aspects of royal life he had never fully appreciated. Thomas, meanwhile, discovered that teaching and mentoring came naturally to him, and he began to understand that his value to the organization extended far beyond simply following orders. The change in Thomas's demeanor was noticeable to everyone who worked with him. The defeated posture and guarded expression that had characterized him in recent months were replaced by renewed confidence and purpose. He walked taller, spoke with more assurance, and began to engage more actively with his colleagues. Worthington and Blackwood initially watched these developments with confusion and growing unease. The man they had been systematically trying to undermine was suddenly being given prestigious assignments and was spending time with members of the royal family. Their casual cruelty had been based on the assumption that Thomas was somehow inferior and would remain in a subordinate position indefinitely. During one of their informal gatherings, Worthington expressed his bewilderment to Blackwood. "I don't understand what's happening with Mitchell. First, the captain gives him these special assignments, and now he's providing private instruction to Prince George." Blackwood, equally puzzled, could only shake his head. "Maybe someone put in a word for him, though I can't imagine who would bother." What they couldn't understand was that Thomas's knowledge, dedication, and character had always been evident to those who took the time to look beyond surface prejudices. The opportunities he was now receiving weren't charity or favoritism. They were recognition of abilities and qualities that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored. George continued to observe the dynamics among the guards, noting the subtle changes in how Thomas was being treated by most of his colleagues. The newfound respect he was receiving from leadership seemed to create a ripple effect, with many guards beginning to seek his advice on protocol questions and historical details. However, George also noticed that Worthington and Blackwood were becoming increasingly isolated in their hostility toward Thomas. Their obvious resentment of his success was beginning to reflect poorly on them, and other guards were starting to distance themselves from their negative attitudes. One afternoon, George witnessed a particularly telling interaction. A new recruit was struggling to understand a complex drill movement, and several guards were trying to help him master the technique. Thomas stepped forward and provided clear, patient instruction that helped the young man finally execute the movement correctly. "Thank you, sir," the recruit said gratefully. "That explanation was exactly what I needed." Worthington, who had been standing nearby, made a dismissive comment under his breath about amateur instruction from amateurs. Several other guards heard the remark and looked at him with obvious disapproval. Sergeant Williams, a respected veteran with 15 years of service, spoke up firmly. Mitchell's instruction is thorough and accurate. Perhaps you could learn something from his teaching approach, Worthington. George saw the flash of anger and embarrassment that crossed Worthington's face, and he realized that the man's behavior was beginning to have social consequences within the group. The isolation that Thomas had experienced was slowly shifting to the bullies themselves. That evening, George reflected on the changes he had observed over the past few weeks. Their plan was working, but not simply because they had given Thomas opportunities to succeed. It was working because those opportunities had allowed Thomas's true character and abilities to become visible to everyone around him. George was learning valuable lessons about leadership and human nature. He was seeing how systems of respect and recognition could either elevate people or diminish them, and how small changes in those systems could have profound effects on individual lives and group dynamics. He was also beginning to understand that addressing injustice was not a single action, but an ongoing process that required patience, strategy, and sustained commitment. The harassment that Thomas had experienced hadn't been eliminated overnight, but the conditions that had allowed it to flourish were gradually being changed. As George prepared for his next session with Thomas, he looked forward not only to learning more about royal traditions, but to continuing to witness the transformation of a good man who was finally receiving the recognition and respect he had always deserved. The young prince was discovering that one of the most rewarding aspects of leadership was creating conditions where others could succeed and flourish. The transformation that had begun several weeks earlier was now becoming impossible to ignore. Thomas Mitchell's presentation to the French military delegation had been not just successful, but genuinely impressive. The visiting officers had been thoroughly engaged by his detailed knowledge of British military traditions and his ability to explain complex protocols in clear, accessible language. Word of his expertise was spreading beyond the castle walls, and requests for similar briefings were beginning to arrive from other diplomatic missions. George had attended the presentation, officially as part of his education about international relations, but privately to witness Thomas's moment of recognition. As he watched the French officers ask increasingly sophisticated questions and receive thoughtful, comprehensive answers, George felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with seeing justice finally being served. Captain Harrison, who had also observed the presentation, approached Thomas afterward with obvious pride and satisfaction. "Outstanding work, Mitchell. I've received 3 requests this week for similar briefings. It seems your reputation is spreading." Thomas felt a warmth that he hadn't experienced since joining the Guard. For the first time in months, he was being valued for his contributions rather than judged for his background. "Thank you, sir. I'm honored to serve in this capacity." "There's something else," Captain Harrison continued. "I'm recommending you for promotion to Lance Sergeant. Your leadership with the new recruits and your expertise in historical protocols make you an obvious choice for increased responsibility." The news hit Thomas like a physical force. A promotion meant not only increased pay and responsibility, but also a level of recognition that would make it much more difficult for anyone to question his place within the organization. More importantly, it represented validation of his worth as a soldier and as a person. Meanwhile, the social dynamics among the guards were continuing to shift in ways that George found both fascinating and encouraging to observe. Thomas's success was creating a ripple effect that was changing how the entire group related to each other. The new recruits, in particular, had begun to see Thomas as a mentor and role model. His patience with their questions, his willingness to share his knowledge, and his genuine concern for their professional development had earned him their respect and admiration. Several of them had started coming to him with problems and concerns that went beyond mere protocol questions. Private James Cooper, a 20-year-old from Birmingham whose working-class background was similar to Thomas's, had been struggling with confidence issues since arriving at the castle. The grandeur of his surroundings and the formal nature of his duties had left him feeling uncertain about his ability to meet the high standards expected of the Queen's Guard. "Sergeant Mitchell," Cooper said one afternoon, using Thomas's new rank with obvious respect, "I was wondering if you could give me some advice about handling the pressure of this position." Thomas recognized something of his own experience in the young man's uncertainty. "What specifically is troubling you, Cooper?" It's just that everything here is so formal and traditional, Cooper admitted. Sometimes I feel like I don't really belong, like everyone can tell that I don't come from the kind of background that's supposed to produce royal guards. Thomas felt a familiar tightening in his chest, remembering the months when he had harbored similar doubts about his own place within the organization. Cooper, let me tell you something important. Your value as a guard has nothing to do with where you came from and everything to do with your dedication, your integrity, and your willingness to serve something larger than yourself. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Thomas sharing insights he had gained through his own struggles and victories. By the end, Cooper's posture was noticeably straighter, and there was a new confidence in his eyes. George, who happened to overhear part of this conversation while passing through the area, was struck by the natural mentoring ability that Thomas displayed. The man was not just sharing technical knowledge, but providing emotional support and encouragement to someone who needed it. This was leadership in its most essential form, helping others discover their own strength and potential. However, not everyone was pleased with the changes that were taking place. Worthington and Blackwood were becoming increasingly frustrated and bitter as they watched Thomas's star rise within the organization. Their attempts to undermine him had not only failed, but had begun to backfire in ways they hadn't anticipated. During a private conversation in one of the more remote areas of the castle, Worthington gave voice to his resentment. This whole situation with Mitchell is getting out of hand. Now he's got some kind of special relationship with the royal family, and Harrison is treating him like some kind of expert. Blackwood nodded grimly. Someone must have put in a word for him. There's no way he could have earned all this on his own merit. The problem is that now other people are starting to look at us like we're the ones who don't belong, Worthington continued, his voice bitter with frustration. Did you see how Williams spoke to me yesterday, like I was some kind of recruit who didn't know what he was talking about? What neither man understood was that their treatment of Thomas had never been invisible to their colleagues. Other guards had witnessed their behavior and had found it distasteful, but in the absence of clear leadership signals about acceptable conduct, many had chosen to remain silent rather than confront the bullies directly. Now, however, with Thomas clearly being valued and recognized by leadership, speaking out against harassment was no longer risky. In fact, continuing to support or participate in such behavior was becoming the risky choice, both socially and professionally. Sergeant Williams, who had become increasingly vocal in his criticism of Worthington's attitude, decided to address the issue more directly. During a team meeting, he made remarks about the importance of mutual respect and professional conduct that were clearly directed at Worthington and Blackwood, though he was careful not to name them specifically. The strength of our unit depends on each member feeling valued and supported, Williams said, his eyes moving deliberately around the room. When we tear each other down instead of building each other up, we weaken not only individuals, but the entire organization. The message was received loud and clear by everyone in the room, including George, who had arranged to observe the meeting as part of his education about military leadership. The young prince was learning that cultural change often happened through exactly this kind of gradual shift in what was considered acceptable behavior within a group. After the meeting, George approached Sergeant Williams privately. "That was an excellent presentation about teamwork and mutual support," he said. Williams smiled, recognizing the subtext in George's comment. "Thank you, Your Highness. I believe strongly that every member of our team deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their background or circumstances." "I couldn't agree more," George replied, and Williams understood that his message had been received and approved at the highest levels. Over the following days, the pressure on Worthington and Blackwood intensified as their isolation within the group became more pronounced. Other guards were no longer just passively disapproving of their behavior. They were actively distancing themselves from it and making their disapproval known through small but significant social cues. The breaking point came during a training exercise when Worthington made another disparaging comment about Thomas's background, this time within earshot of several guards and Captain Harrison himself. The comment was met with uncomfortable silence, followed by visible anger from the captain. "Worthington," Captain Harrison said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument, "I need to see you in my office immediately." The private conversation that followed was brief but decisive. Captain Harrison made it clear that Worthington's attitude and behavior were unacceptable, and that any further incidents would result in formal disciplinary action. The days when such behavior could be overlooked or tolerated were over. When Worthington emerged from the captain's office, his face was pale, and his usual arrogance had been replaced by obvious anxiety. Word of the meeting spread quickly through the ranks, and everyone understood that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. George observed these developments with a mixture of satisfaction and thoughtfulness. The cultural change they had initiated was now taking on a life of its own, creating positive feedback loops that were making the environment better for everyone, not just for Thomas. That evening, during one of his regular sessions with Thomas, George reflected on what they had both learned through this experience. "Thomas," he said, "I've been thinking about how organizations change and grow. It seems to me that sometimes small actions can have much larger effects than anyone initially realizes." Thomas, who had no idea about George's role in initiating the changes that had so dramatically improved his circumstances, nodded thoughtfully. "I've noticed that too, Your Highness. Sometimes it just takes one person recognizing value that was already there for everything to shift." George smiled at the truth of this observation, though he understood it from a slightly different perspective than Thomas did. "What do you think makes the difference between organizations where people thrive and organizations where they struggle?" "Leadership," Thomas replied without hesitation. "When leaders make it clear that everyone's contributions are valued and that respect is non-negotiable, it creates an environment where people can be their best selves. When leaders ignore problems or allow some people to be diminished, it creates an environment where everyone suffers, even the bullies themselves." George nodded, filing away this insight for future reference. He was learning that effective leadership was not about having all the answers, but about creating conditions where the right answers could emerge and where everyone could contribute their best efforts toward common goals. As their session concluded, George felt a deep sense of pride, not just in what they had accomplished, but in what Thomas had become through this process. The man's confidence and sense of purpose were now unshakable, and his influence within the organization was growing daily. More importantly, Thomas was using his own experience to help others who faced similar challenges. 6 months had passed since that autumn morning when George had witnessed the harassment behind the stone pillar, and the transformation within the Queen's Guard was now complete and irreversible. Thomas Mitchell, now Lance Sergeant Mitchell, had become one of the most respected and influential members of the unit. His expertise was sought not only within the castle walls, but by military historians and protocol experts from around the world. The changes that had begun with George's intervention had created a culture shift that extended far beyond Thomas's individual circumstances. The entire organization now operated with a heightened awareness of the importance of mutual respect and the value of diverse backgrounds and experiences. Captain Harrison had implemented formal policies regarding professional conduct and had established mentorship programs that paired experienced guards with newcomers. These changes had been presented as natural evolutions of military best practices, but George knew that they were direct responses to the problems he had originally observed. On this particular morning, George stood in the same courtyard where he had first witnessed the harassment, but now he was there for a ceremony that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. Thomas was being formally recognized for his contributions to diplomatic relations and military education, receiving a commendation that would become part of his permanent military record. As George watched the ceremony, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had started as an act of moral courage on his part had evolved into something much larger and more complex. The lessons he had learned about leadership, justice, and the power of creating opportunities for others had shaped his understanding of what it meant to serve in a position of privilege and responsibility. Prince William stood beside his son, also observing the ceremony with evident satisfaction. The collaboration between father and son in addressing the harassment situation had strengthened their relationship and had given William confidence in George's judgment and leadership potential. "You should feel proud of what you accomplished," William said quietly to George as they watched Thomas accept his commendation with the dignity and grace that had always characterized him. "I think we all accomplished something important," George replied, his mature response reflecting the growth he had experienced through this process. "Thomas accomplished it by never losing sight of his own worth, even when others tried to diminish him. You accomplished it by trusting my judgment and helping me develop an effective plan. The entire organization accomplished it by choosing to embrace change rather than resist it. William smiled at his son's inclusive perspective. George had learned that true leadership meant sharing credit for successes while taking responsibility for failures, and that sustainable change required the commitment of many people working toward common goals. After the ceremony, George approached Thomas privately to offer his congratulations. The relationship between them had evolved into genuine friendship over the months of their regular sessions, built on mutual respect and shared interests rather than the formality that typically characterized royal interactions with staff. "Congratulations, Lance Sergeant Mitchell," George said with genuine warmth. "This recognition is well-deserved." "Thank you, Your Highness," Thomas replied, his face glowing with pride and satisfaction. "I want you to know how much our sessions have meant to me. Teaching you about military history and traditions has reminded me why I love this work so much." George felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that their relationship had been mutually beneficial. He had genuinely learned a great deal from Thomas about aspects of royal life and British military history that he would never have discovered through traditional academic study. "Actually," George said, "I have a proposal for you. I've been thinking about writing a book about the evolution of royal ceremonies and their historical significance. Would you be interested in collaborating with me on this project?" Thomas's eyes widened with surprise and excitement. The opportunity to co-author a book with a member of the royal family was beyond anything he could have imagined when he first joined the Guard. "I would be deeply honored, Your Highness," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "That sounds like a fascinating project." As they discussed the potential scope and approach for the book, George realized that this collaboration would serve multiple purposes. It would provide Thomas with additional recognition for his expertise. It would create a lasting record of important historical traditions, and it would demonstrate the value of partnerships that crossed traditional social boundaries. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of the cultural changes within the Queen's Guard continued to spread throughout the royal household and beyond. Other departments had begun adopting similar approaches to professional development and conflict resolution, recognizing the positive effects that respectful, inclusive leadership could have on both individual performance and organizational effectiveness. Worthington and Blackwood had both undergone their own transformations, though their paths had been different from Thomas's. Worthington, after his confrontation with Captain Harrison, had been forced to examine his own attitudes and behavior. The process had been uncomfortable and humbling, but ultimately beneficial. He had gradually come to understand that his sense of superiority had been based not on genuine achievement or character, but on circumstances beyond his control and prejudices he had absorbed without question. The isolation he had experienced as a result of his behavior had given him time to reflect on the kind of person he wanted to be and the kind of legacy he wanted to leave. In a moment of unexpected grace, Worthington had approached Thomas privately to offer a sincere apology for his previous behavior. The conversation had been awkward and difficult, but it had marked the beginning of a grudging respect between the two men that would eventually develop into a functional working relationship. Blackwood's transformation had been more dramatic. Recognizing that his association with Worthington had damaged his reputation and career prospects, he had requested a transfer to a different unit. The fresh start had allowed him to develop better relationships with his colleagues and to contribute more positively to his work environment. George had observed these changes with interest and had learned valuable lessons about the possibility of redemption and growth, even among those who had engaged in harmful behavior. He was beginning to understand that effective leadership sometimes meant creating opportunities for people to become better versions of themselves, rather than simply punishing them for their mistakes. The young prince had also learned important lessons about the complexity of systemic change. Addressing Thomas's individual situation had been only the beginning of a much larger process of cultural transformation that required ongoing attention and commitment. Captain Harrison had become a strong advocate for the changes they had implemented, and he had begun sharing their approaches with other military units and organizations. The model they had developed was proving effective in addressing not just harassment based on social class, but other forms of discrimination and exclusion as well. One evening, as George reflected on everything that had transpired since that autumn morning, he wrote in his personal journal about the lessons he had learned through this experience. I used to think that leadership was about telling people what to do and having them follow your instructions. Now I understand that real leadership is about creating conditions where people can discover their own strength and potential. It's about building systems that bring out the best in everyone, rather than just protecting the interests of those who already have advantages. He continued writing, I learned that privilege is not something to feel guilty about, but it is something to use responsibly. The accident of my birth gave me power and influence that most people will never have. The question is not whether I deserve these advantages, but how I can use them to make the world more fair and just for others. The young prince also wrote about the importance of sustained commitment to change. Addressing injustice is not a single action that you take once and then forget about. It requires ongoing attention and effort to maintain the changes you create and to continue improving the systems that affect people's lives. As George closed his journal and prepared for bed, he thought about Thomas, who was probably at home with his family, planning for his new responsibilities and excited about their upcoming book project. The man's life had been transformed not through charity or favoritism, but through the recognition and development of abilities that had always been present. George also thought about the other guards, including Worthington and Blackwood, who had all learned important lessons about respect, dignity, and the value of creating inclusive environments where everyone could succeed. The young prince had discovered that one of the most rewarding aspects of leadership was watching other people flourish when given the opportunity to do so. He had learned that standing up to injustice required not just moral courage, but strategic thinking and sustained commitment to change. Most importantly, George had learned that his position as a member of the royal family gave him both the power and the responsibility to use his influence to protect and elevate others. This understanding would shape his approach to leadership for the rest of his life, guiding him toward a model of service that was based not on privilege and tradition alone, but on justice, compassion, and the fundamental dignity of every individual. The morning sun that had witnessed the beginning of this story continued to rise over Windsor Castle, illuminating a place where ancient traditions and modern values had found a way to coexist and strengthen each other. The young prince who had started this journey as an observer had become a leader, and the guard who had been struggling to maintain his dignity had become a respected teacher and collaborator. The story that had begun with an act of casual cruelty had ended with lasting institutional change and genuine transformation for everyone involved. George had learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but with patient effort, strategic thinking, and an unwavering commitment to treating every person with the respect and dignity they deserve.